This video is brought to you by Ground News. Earlier this week, protests broke out across Cuba over shortages of essential items and electricity blackouts, which have become increasingly common in Cuba's big cities since the pandemic. Videos on social media show people chanting "power and food," and there were even reports of protesters storming police stations to release arrested protesters. This is pretty remarkable. Protests in Cuba are very rare, and are usually met with harsh repression from Cuba's communist government, which is currently led by President Miguel Díaz-Canel, who succeeded Fidel Castro's brother Raúl in 2021. This has sparked a bit of a blame game between the US, which blames the Cuban government for failing to embrace democracy, and Cuba, which blames the ever-expanding 62-year-old American trade embargo on the island. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the recent protests, the ongoing trade embargo, and what happens next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, to understand this story, you need to know a bit about Cuba's economic crisis, which really began in earnest during the pandemic. The fundamental issue at hand is that Cuba is very import dependent. It imports about 70% of its food and over half its fuel and medicines. Cuba's domestic currency, the peso, doesn't have much purchasing power on the international market, so Cuba usually buys these imports with foreign currency. Unfortunately for ordinary Cubans, the pandemic significantly depleted the country's foreign currency reserves, both because imports like food and fuel became more expensive, and because a drop in tourism and a weak harvest meant less foreign currency inflows. Anyway, a lack of foreign currency inflows means less imports, creating shortages of food, fuel and medicine. And in February, the Cuban government had to ask the UN for help with food shortages, sending an unprecedented request for assistance in providing powdered milk to children under the age of 7. Unsurprisingly, these shortages have had a destabilising effect on Cuban politics, and are the proximate cause of the protests we've seen over the past few days. The severity of Cuba's economic crisis has pushed the country into a series of economic doom loops. Crumbling public services, including healthcare and education, now exert a drag on growth, which in turn means less tax revenues and thus further deterioration of public services, an extreme version of the austerity doom loop some European countries experienced in the 2010s. Political instability has spooked tourists, who used to account for 11% of GDP pre-pandemic. A dearth of economic opportunities has also fueled an exodus of young, educated Cubans, with more than 400,000 people, about 4% of the island's population, emigrating to the US in just the past 2 years. To address this surge in emigration, last year the Biden administration unveiled a humanitarian parole program, allowing Cubans with a sponsor to do temporary work in the US, through which 50,000 have already applied. Anyway, the recent protests sparked a bit of a blame game between Cuba and the US. The White House Assistant Secretary seemed to tacitly blame the Cuban government for failing to embrace democracy and respect the rights of Cuban citizens. Cuba quickly hit back, summoning the US ambassador in Cuba and describing the protest as the responsibility of the US government, presumably a reference to America's ongoing blockade of the island. To be fair to Cuba here, they've got a point. For those of you who don't know, Cuba has been under a US trade embargo since the early 1960s, the longest in modern history, after Fidel Castro took power during the Cuban Revolution. Originally, this just meant that US companies and individuals weren't able to trade with Cuba, but in 1996, this was expanded to include foreign companies with the Helms-Burton Act, which said that any foreign company that trades with Cuba is prohibited from doing business in the US. The embargo was relaxed somewhat under Obama, who tried to normalise relations, but any progress was immediately reversed by Trump, who then expanded the sanctions regime. Perhaps most significantly, one of Trump's final acts in office was to add Cuba to the US list of state sponsors of terrorism, which made it significantly harder for Cuba to trade internationally. This is obviously especially bad news for an import-dependent country, and, compounded with the effect of the pandemic, it's had a crippling effect on Cuba's economy and society. During his campaign, Biden attacked Trump's failed Cuba policy and vowed to reverse his harmful policies. But to ordinary Cubans' disappointment, this hasn't yet happened. This blockade is almost definitely illegal under international law, And the UN General Assembly has passed a resolution every year since 1992 demanding the end to the embargo, with the United States and Israel being the only nations to consistently vote against the resolutions. Now, that's not to say that the Cuban government isn't at least partly responsible. While the government managed the first wave of the pandemic remarkably well, they didn't fare so well with subsequent waves driven by more infectious variants. But perhaps more significantly, in the last few years, the government has tried to move away from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented one. But recent efforts haven't gone brilliantly. A botched attempt at unifying Cuba's complicated currency regime in 2021 helped push the peso's market exchange rate from about 50 to the dollar in 2021 to over 300 today. Cuts to subsidies have stoked rapid inflation, with the price of gasoline rising by over 400%. But Cuba is still expected to run an enormous and unsustainable deficit, representing over 18% of GDP in 2024. All in all, while the US embargo might be the primary cause of Cuba's woes, the government's cack-handed attempt at reform clearly haven't helped, and the recent protests, plus the unprecedented number of Cubans emigrating to the US, do suggest that the current government is dangerously unpopular. The government's response is telling in this respect. Addressing a crowd of protesters in Santiago from a rooftop, the first secretary of Santiago's Communist Party said the government understood the protesters' demands and promised to provide more food in the coming days. This is a marked contrast to how the government responded to the last serious protests in 2021, when they cracked down hard and arrested more than 1,000 protesters. So, what happens next? Well, the odds of the government actually collapsing are low at the moment, not least because there's no obvious alternative. But that doesn't mean that things are going to get better. Without some drastic change, it's hard to see how Cuba gets out of the economic doom loop anytime soon, and therefore hard to see how the government can re-establish its legitimacy, given that economic prosperity is really the only way for Cuba's non-democratic regime to appease the Cuban public. Now, to know what happens next, you need to keep up with what's going on in the world. And, lucky for you, our sponsor Ground News is your ultimate tool for easily navigating news coverage. Their app and website creates really comprehensive story overviews on any topic, so you can easily compare how news is covered across the world and political spectrum. For every article reporting on a story, you'll see the source's political bias, how factual they are, and even who owns them. For example, this story about Rishi Sunak refusing to rule out a May general election. Not only can I see that there are 7 sources reporting, I can quickly identify which sources have a political bias, according to ratings from independent news monitoring organisations. What's interesting about this story is that it's mostly being covered by 4 left-leaning news outlets, and only 1 right-leaning outlet. I also especially like their blind spot feed, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum. For example, if you lean right, you might have missed this story about the US House of Representatives voting on a TikTok ban. It's unlike any other news app you've come across, so go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link down in the description to get 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan. That's only $5 a month to help an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.